Hi, friend. Welcome to Rainy Tales, a quiet place for gentle stories told beneath the sound of rain. Now, let's begin tonight's story. The rain began softly, like a whisper brushing against the window pane. It wasn't the kind of storm that demanded attention. It simply existed, falling with quiet purpose, filling the air with the scent of wet earth and old memories. Inside the small room, a single candle flickered on the wooden table, its flame steady yet fragile, casting a gentle amber light that swayed in rhythm with the wind outside. The cup beside it still steamed faintly, jasmine tea filling the space with a warmth that mingled beautifully with the scent of rain. The world beyond the glass had dissolved into silver blur. Street lights became smudges of gold in the mist, and the outlines of trees shivered under the soft downpour. It was the kind of evening when time seemed to slow down, when even the clock on the wall ticked a little more softly, as if not to disturb the peace that the rain had brought. The candle glowed brighter for a moment, as if sensing the stillness. It wasn't new. Its wax had melted unevenly, shaping tiny ridges like waves frozen in motion. The flame danced within its small sea of wax, alive but calm, and for reasons the narrator couldn't quite explain, that tiny light felt like companionship. They sat there, watching, not thinking much, just listening to the steady rhythm of rain tapping the glass. There was something almost human about the way it breathed, falling, pausing, falling again. Each drop seemed to say, "You can rest now." The room was small, almost bare. A bookshelf lined with worn spines. A journal lying open with no words yet written tonight. The soft hum of an old refrigerator somewhere down the hall. Every object seemed to have its own quiet personality, its own story shaped by years of being noticed and forgotten in equal measure. Outside, thunder murmured from a far distance, low, rolling, unthreatening. The narrator smiled faintly. Storms used to frighten them once. When they were young, they would cover their ears and hide under blankets, afraid the sky might break apart. But now, years later, the same sound brought comfort. It reminded them of being alive, of how fragile and precious stillness can feel when the world trembles. Beyond your window, they lifted the cup and sipped the tea. It was slightly oversteeped, bitter around the edges, but warm enough to soften the throat. The candle's flame wavered with each breath, and for a moment, it felt as if the whole room breathed along with them. Inhale, exhale, flicker, glow. Outside, the rain thickened, tracing long streams down the glass. Drops collided, merged, slid downward in slow trails that reflected the candlelight. The narrator followed one with their eyes until it disappeared at the bottom of the pane, where it joined countless others, forming tiny silver rivers. It was strange how something as simple as water could be so mesmerizing, how it could wash thoughts clean without asking permission. A notebook lay nearby, its cover slightly warped from years of use. They reached for it, then stopped. There was no need to write tonight. Some nights are not meant for words, only for listening. The candle continued to glow, a quiet witness to all the unspoken. Things floating in the air, small regrets, unvoiced hopes, the memory of a laugh long gone. Its light didn't erase the shadows, but it softened them. It reminded the heart that light and dark were not enemies, only companions taking turns. The narrator leaned back in the chair, eyes half closed, body melting into the rhythm of rain. In that stillness, they could almost feel the world breathing with them. The leaves, the clouds, the quiet streets, even the candle that refused to burn out. Everything seemed to whisper the same truth, that peace doesn't come from silence or control, but from the gentle acceptance of what is. The flame dipped suddenly, a soft sigh of wax giving way beneath it, then steadied again. It made them think of people, how easily we waver, how beautiful it is when we stay. Outside, thunder rolled once more, softer this time, as if the storm were remembering to be kind. And in that gentle sound, the narrator found comfort, because sometimes all we need is to know that even the wildest storms can hum instead of roar. The candle's reflection trembled on the window, glowing faintly beside the silver rain. For a brief moment, the two lights, one born of fire, the other of water, seemed to merge, blurring together like memory and dream. And as the rain kept falling, the narrator smiled quietly, whispering to no one in particular, "Let it rain. The candle will hold." The rain had settled into a soft, steady rhythm now, the kind that could lull even the most restless heart into calm. The candle still burned, its flame smaller but more certain, a quiet anchor in the dim room. Outside, the wind sighed through the narrow alley, brushing against old shutters and carrying with it the scent of wet leaves. Inside, everything was warm and slow, as if time had agreed to pause for just a while. The narrator sat near the window, their hands wrapped around the teacup that had gone cold, but still felt comforting to hold. The ceramic surface carried the faint warmth of earlier moments, like an echo of human touch. The clock on the wall ticked softly, and each sound seemed to join the rain's rhythm. Tick, drop, tick, drop, until even silence became music. It was a quiet room, yes, but not empty. It was filled with small presences, the faint hum of the fridge, the whisper of wind under the door, the scent of jasmine tea fading slowly into the air. The wooden floor creaked from time to time, as if the house were adjusting its breath. There was peace in these sounds, an old, humble kind of peace that didn't demand attention. It simply existed, the way light lingers on dust or rain finds its way home to the sea. The narrator let their eyes wander. The bookshelf by the wall still leaned slightly to one side, its old wood swollen from years of humidity. The books were arranged without order: novels, letters, journals, a few forgotten postcards tucked between pages like pressed leaves from another life. On the windowsill rested a small stone from a beach long ago, smooth and cool to the touch. It had no meaning except the one memory gave it. There was also a framed photograph, its edges curled slightly from age. Two figures stood in the rain, one small, one taller, sharing a bright yellow umbrella. The photo was blurred, the kind taken quickly before the moment slipped away. The narrator stared at it for a long while. The smaller figure was them, years ago, holding on to the hand of someone who had always felt like home. The candle's light trembled, and for a heartbeat, the photograph seemed alive, the shimmer of water on the umbrella, the faint smile on both faces, the shared warmth of that rainy day. But then the moment faded, leaving only the hum of rain and the soft glow of wax. They exhaled slowly. There had been many rooms since that one, many storms too, but somehow this quiet space felt like a return to something forgotten, a small piece of life unbroken by the noise of everything else. Here, surrounded by gentle things, even loneliness felt softer, less a wound, more a kind of still water, reflecting the world back kindly. They rose and moved to the window, resting a palm against the cool glass. Outside, droplets rolled down in endless threads, catching the lamplight from the street below. The world looked hazy but kind, wrapped in its own silence. It was in this quiet, in the pause between raindrops, that the narrator began to notice small details, the way the candlelight trembled against the curtain, how the steam had left faint clouds on the window pane, how the reflection seemed both older and calmer than they remembered. There was beauty in this stillness, a kind of unspoken language that only rain could translate. They whispered something to themselves, words barely formed, more feeling than sentence. I think I needed this. Outside, a car passed through the wet street, leaving behind a long silver trail of reflected light. The sound faded quickly, swallowed by rain again. It reminded the narrator of how temporary everything was, how even noise dissolves into quiet eventually. they turned back toward the room. The candle flame bowed slightly, as if acknowledging their gaze. It flickered once, twice, and steadied again. The light made the shadows on the wall dance gentle, slow, like the memory of someone swaying to music only they could hear. They smiled softly. This was what healing looked like. Sometimes not grand gestures, not sudden clarity, but a small light in a small room while the rain reminded you that you were still here. The narrator sank into the chair again, curling their legs beneath them. The fabric of the blanket brushed their skin, soft and familiar. The rhythm of rain filled the silence once more, a heartbeat larger than their own. If anyone had asked what they were doing that night, they wouldn't have had an answer. They weren't writing or thinking or even trying to rest. They were simply being, sitting in the company of a candle and a storm, both fragile and strong in their own ways. The tea was cold, the pages still blank, but somehow none of it mattered. In that quiet room, beneath the whisper of rain, they felt something return, a gentleness they hadn't known they'd lost. They closed their eyes for a moment, listening. The sound of the storm outside seemed to sync with their breathing, as if the world itself had chosen to exhale with them. And when they opened their eyes again, the candle was still burning, steady and patient, its tiny flame writing poetry across the air. Thunder rolled again in the distant soft, like an old friend clearing his throat before speaking. The rain had thickened into a velvet curtain now, and each drop felt slower, heavier, as if the sky itself had grown thoughtful. The candle flame bent low, then straightened, steady in its quiet defiance. The narrator leaned back, letting the rhythm of the storm wash through the room. It carried them somewhere far away into the soft, unguarded corners of memory where time folds into itself. They were small again, perhaps 6 or 7. The power had gone out that night, and the house had filled with darkness deeper than the sea. The only light came from a lantern their mother had placed on the table. It was a metal one, with a glass window clouded from years of smoke. The wick burned with a faint orange glow, sputtering whenever the wind slipped through the cracks in the old wooden door. Outside, the storm had been louder than angrier, maybe. Thunder had cracked open the sky, and lightning flashed so bright it carved white veins into the darkness. Each time it struck, the child had flinched, covering their ears, heart racing in a rhythm far too fast for such a small chest. But their mother, she hadn't seemed afraid. She had sat beside them with that quiet strength only grown-ups seemed to know. Her hands had rested over the child's small ones, warm and still. She didn't tell them not to be afraid. She just stayed. And that, somehow, had been enough. The memory of her voice floated through the years now, soft as candlelight. It's only the sky speaking, love. It's loud because it has stories to tell. The narrator smiled faintly at the thought. How many years had passed since that night? Decades, maybe. Yet the warmth of that moment had never faded. It was strange how some memories refused to dim, how they kept burning quietly in some hidden corner of the heart, like a candle that never quite goes out. Back then, they had asked, "What if the candle dies, Mama?" And she had answered, "Then we light another one." The dark isn't the end. It's just the space waiting for light to return. That single sentence had stayed with them all their life, even as they grew up and forgot so many other things. Now, sitting here in this quiet room, the same truth shimmered between the raindrops outside. Every flicker of the candle, every echo of thunder felt like a reminder. Resilience wasn't loud. It was this gentle, enduring, alive in the smallest places. They could still remember how the rain had sounded on the old tin roof back then, like 1,000 small drums, played by unseen hands. It had frightened them at first, that wild rhythm, but as the hours passed and the lantern's glow softened the shadows, something inside had shifted. They had begun to listen differently. What once sounded like chaos became music, then comfort. The candle on their table now flickered, just as that lantern had so many years ago. The scent of wax mixed with rain and faint tea, a blend that somehow carried both then and now in the same breath. They rose slowly, walking to the bookshelf. Between two old novels sat a faded matchbox. Inside were a few unused candles, their sides marked with dust. They took one out, holding it for a while between their fingers. The wax was smooth, cool. It reminded them that even the unlit carried quiet promise dot. As thunder murmured again, they set the spare candle beside the burning one, a silent companion waiting for its turn. It felt like an act of gratitude for the mother who once stayed through the storm, for the child who had once learned not to fear the dark, and for this present self who could now sit calmly and listen. The rain softened. The world outside shimmered with reflection streetlights stretching across puddles like melted stars. Somewhere, a dog barked faintly, then silence returned. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for words. Only presence. The narrator whispered, barely audible. "Thank you." They weren't sure who the words were for their mother, the rain, or the candle itself, but somehow it didn't matter. Gratitude rarely needs a direction. It simply exists, like light finding its way through cracks. They sat down again, wrapping the blanket closer. The candle burned steadily, its wax slowly forming a small lake of golden light at its base. They thought about how every flame holds a memory, how each storm carries its own lesson in patience. Maybe this was what healing meant, not the absence of storms, but learning to keep a light burning through them. The window fogged over completely now, blurring the outside world into soft gray. The candle's reflection glowed faintly against the glass, and for a long time, they simply watched it this small, trembling sun that had survived every breath of wind out, and somewhere inside them, the child who once feared thunder smiled too. The rain kept falling through the night, weaving its quiet music into every corner of the room. The candle was burning lower now, its wax pooling gently around the base like a small golden sea. The narrator sat still, feeling the rhythm of the storm settle into their chest. Something about this night felt heavier, not with sadness, but with memory, the kind that knocks softly before entering. There was a box beneath the table, an old wooden one with chipped corners and a brass latch that squeaked when opened. It had followed the narrator through many homes and many years, tucked away in closets, attics, or under beds. They hadn't opened it in a long time. Tonight, though, the candle's light seemed to beckon it back into the world. They reached down, feeling the cool wood beneath their fingers. The lock gave easily. Inside were things that time had almost forgotten. Folded letters tied with faded string, a few photographs curling at the edges, a pressed leaf, a fountain pen that hadn't written in years. The scent of old paper rose up softly, mingling with rain and wax, a perfume of nostalgia. The letters were all in their handwriting, though some ink had blurred into small shadows of blue. None had ever been sent. Some were addressed to people who were long gone, others to those who had once been close, but drifted away quietly, like clouds. And a few were to no one at all, just words meant to be said somewhere. Somehow, they untied the string carefully. Unfolding the first page, "Dear M," it began, the letters slightly crooked, as if written by a trembling hand. I still think about that night, sometimes the one where we said nothing for hours, and it was enough. I hope you still have moments like that, wherever you are. The narrator smiled faintly. They could remember writing it on a night not unlike this one years ago. The rain had been falling then, too. It was strange how water could carry memories, how storms seemed to remember us even when we tried to forget them. They read another. "Dear me, please don't be afraid to rest. You've run long enough. It's okay to slow down." That one made them pause. The handwriting was softer, more hesitant. Perhaps it had been written after one of those long days when the heart forgets its own weight. They folded it gently, pressing it back against the others. Unsent letters were a strange kind of confession. They didn't ask for forgiveness or answers. They were simply small lights in bottles, left to drift in the ocean of time. Maybe no one would ever read them. Maybe that was the point. They placed the stack of letters on the table beside the candle. The flame leaned closer, as if curious. The paper glowed faintly in its warmth outside. The rain whispered against the glass, like fingers tracing old scars on the earth. The sound reminded the narrator of long walks home with an umbrella that always flipped inside out, of nights spent staring at the ceiling, thinking of words they never said, of people they let drift away because silence felt safer than truth. They wondered, if they had sent those letters, would life have turned out differently? Or were some words meant to stay unsent tiny prayers whispered only to the night? The candle flickered, and in that shifting light, they felt an answer forming. Not in words, but in feeling. Maybe healing isn't about rewriting the past. Maybe it's about sitting beside it, quietly, until it no longer hurts to remember. They traced a fingertip along one letter, the paper soft with age. I forgive you. They whispered not to anyone specific, just to the air. Maybe even to themselves. The room seemed to exhale. The rain softened, turning from steady drumming to misty hush. The candle's flame grew still, its reflection trembling faintly in the window. They gathered the letters back into the box, one by one, careful not to rush. Each piece of paper felt lighter now, as if something unseen had been lifted away. When they closed the lid, they didn't latch it. Some doors, after all, were meant to stay slightly open. For a while, they simply sat there, listening. The sound of rain filled the silence between heartbeats. It was a familiar rhythm, one that had carried them through so many nights like this, reminding them that even unsent words have a way of finding peace. They leaned back, whispering into the quiet. Not everything needs to be said to be heard. The candle flickered once in gentle agreement. The storm deepened again near midnight, the wind sighing through the narrow street as if searching for something it had lost. The candle quivered, then steadied, its flame reflected in the rain-streaked glass. The narrator had nearly dozed off in the chair when a faint sound startled them, a soft, hesitant knock at the door. It wasn't loud, just two gentle taps, almost shy. They hesitated for a moment, unsure whether it was real or something imagined in the half-dream haze that rain always brings. But then it came again, the same quiet rhythm, polite and patient. When they opened the door, cool air rushed in, smelling of wet stone and earth. A woman stood there, wrapped in a dark coat soaked through at the shoulders. Her hair clung to her face, and in her hands she carried a small loaf of bread wrapped in paper. "I'm sorry," she said with an embarrassed smile. "The power's out in my apartment again. I saw your light. I thought maybe you had matches to spare." The narrator blinked, surprised but warmed by her presence. They nodded and stepped aside. "Come in. It's warmer here." She hesitated, then entered, leaving her wet shoes near the mat. The candle's glow caught her face, a kind face, lined not by age, but by living. She seemed tired in a way that wasn't physical, the kind of weariness that comes from holding too many days alone. They found another candle in the drawer and lit it, passing it to her. The flame jumped, then bloomed into soft gold, painting warmth across her damp hands. "You can take this one when you go," they said. She smiled again, smaller this time, but it reached her eyes. "Thank you. I didn't mean to interrupt. She looked toward the rain-blurred window. "I don't like storms much." The narrator poured what was left of the jasmine tea into another cup and offered it to her. "You're not interrupting anything," they said. Sometimes a storm's easier when you don't face it alone. She nodded, holding the cup with both hands, inhaling its warmth. For a while, neither spoke. The rain filled the silence between them. Steady and forgiving Dot, it was a strange kind of comfort, two strangers sharing warmth while the world trembled outside. The candlelight drew soft halos around them, making the small room feel almost sacred. After a while, she began to talk. Not much, just small pieces of her life. How she had moved here 2 months ago. How her cat was terrified of thunder. How she baked bread on weekends because it made the house smell like her grandmother's kitchen. Her voice was low, full of pauses, but there was music in it, the kind of music that makes you listen differently. The narrator found themselves smiling more than speaking, nodding at the right moments, letting her words flow through the room like another kind of rain. There was no need for advice, no need for fixing. Sometimes presence itself is a kind of kindness. When she finished her tea, she looked around the small room, her eyes resting on the candle's steady glow. "It's peaceful here," she said softly. "Like time slows down just enough to remember how to breathe." The narrator chuckled quietly. "That's exactly what it does." She glanced at the box on the table, a stack of unsent letters resting beside it. "You write?" "Sometimes," the narrator replied. "Mostly to the past." She smiled knowingly. "It listens better than people do." The rain eased into drizzle. Outside, the streetlights glimmered like tiny moons reflected in puddles. She stood, wrapping her coat tighter, ready to return to her quiet apartment. "Thank you," she said, holding up the small candle. "For this and the tea." The narrator nodded. "Keep it close. Candles don't mind storms. They just shine quieter." She laughed softly. "I'll remember that." When the door closed behind her, the room felt different. Not emptier, but softer somehow, like the air had been touched by something gentle and human. The faint scent of bread lingered where she'd stood, mingling with rain and wax. The narrator returned to the chair, watching the flame dance. For a long time, they thought of her walking through the rain, her small candle glowing like a moving star among the shadows. Dot. It made them think about how light travels, how it doesn't ask who deserves it, only where it's needed. Dot. And as thunder hummed one last time across the dark sky, the narrator whispered into the quiet, "May we all carry a little light for each other." The candle flickered once, as if agreeing. Outside, the storm began to drift away. The room felt lighter after she left, as though her brief presence had opened a window inside the narrator's chest. The candle burned steadily, unhurried, its flame dancing with a soft composure that felt almost alive. It seemed to understand something about the rhythm of storms, how to bend, but never break. Dot, the narrator, watched it for a long while. The small flame moved the way breath moves, rise, fall, pause. There was no struggle in its motion, no urgency, just a patient conversation between wax and air. It reminded them of the way people sometimes find peace not by avoiding hardship, but by learning how to sway with it. Outside, the rain had softened into a mist that barely touched the ground. The sound of dripping from the eaves replaced the storm's earlier fury. The world was exhaling. They leaned forward, elbows on the table, chin resting on clasped hands, eyes tracing the candle's glow. It flickered gently, never in the same way twice. The narrator thought, every flame has its own language. Sometimes it leans toward you, as if whispering a secret. Sometimes it draws back, shy. Sometimes it stretches high, reaching for air. And sometimes it folds low, protecting its own heart from wind. They realized that to truly see a candle, one had to slow down, really slow down to its rhythm. They found themselves whispering, "Teach me how to stay steady." The flame tilted, flickered, straightened again. It didn't answer, not in words, but in presence. A thought came quietly then. like a leaf floating through the open window of the mind. Maybe this was what resilience looked like, not the loud defiance of standing strong, but the soft courage of remaining lit. The candle didn't fight the dark. It simply offered light. And that was enough. The narrator reached for their notebook, not to write, but to draw. They sketched a single flame symbol, curved, surrounded by little arcs suggesting movement. Around it, they wrote small notes, alive, gentle, listening. Each stroke of the pencil felt slower than usual, more deliberate. It wasn't art. It was observation, the kind that turns into understanding. They remembered something their mother had once said on a quiet morning long ago, her voice floating from the kitchen, while rain whispered on the roof. Light doesn't rush, dear. It arrives. The words had seemed simple then, but tonight they carried a different weight. Maybe healing, too. Doesn't rush, it just arrives when you stop trying to chase it. The candle's wax had melted into soft waves, the edges curving like petals around the flame. Its scent was faint but comforting, something like honey and old wood. The narrator felt their breath sinking with the rhythm of its flicker slow, calm, full. They closed their eyes for a moment, listening to the world breathing. Rain dripping from the roof, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the pulse in their ears. It all merged into one single steady sound, alive. When they opened their eyes, they noticed how the candlelight painted everything it touched: the books, the walls, even their hands, with a tone that made the world gentler. The light didn't erase imperfections. It caressed them. The cracks in the wood, the dust on the shelf, the fingerprints on the glass all looked softer now, as if forgiven. Maybe that's what light does. They thought it forgives. They stood and walked to the window. The rain had turned to drizzle, silver lines tracing the glass. Across the street, the neighbor's window glowed faintly. They wondered if the woman had lit her candle too. The thought made them smile. A small network of lights scattered across the dark, each one fragile, yet together, enough to make the night feel less lonely. The narrator returned to their chair, pulling the blanket over their knees. The candle's flame leaned toward them again, and for a moment, they imagined it was trying to speak, saying something wordless, yet deeply known. Stay, breathe, you're okay, they whispered back. I know. Outside, a soft wind brushed through the rain, carrying the faint scent of earth washed clean. Inside, the candle glowed brighter for just a heartbeat, as if it too was breathing easier now. The narrator sat in silence for a long time after that, learning again how to listen to the quiet, to the light, and to the small, steady voice within that said, "Keep glowing." Morning was still far away. The rain had softened into a whisper, tapping faintly on the glass, like the delicate hands of a dream that didn't want to wake you. The candle burned low now, but its flame was steady, its quiet light painting the walls in warm shades of gold and amber. The narrator rose and went to the small counter, where a porcelain teapot waited. The old kettle hummed softly as it warmed on the stove, its handle worn smooth from years of use. The sound was gentle, familiar, a comfort, almost as soothing as rain itself. They spooned in jasmine leaves, watching them curl and bloom in the steaming water. The scent rose slowly, mingling with the earthy freshness of the storm. There was something grounding about it, the way aroma could pull you back into your body, reminding you that you're here, that you exist in this small moment of breath and warmth. Carrying the cup back to the table, they sat once more before the candle. The tea shimmered faintly in the glow, a pool of golden calm, mirroring the flame beside it. They breathed in, then out, letting the steam brush across their face. It was strange how simple things, tea, rain, candlelight, could build a whole world of peace around you when you allowed them to. Each had its own rhythm, its own invitation to slow down. The rain fell without rush. The tea cooled without complaint. The candle burned without demand, and the heart, if given enough stillness, began to follow their lead. They lifted the cup and sipped. The first taste was gentle but vivid, floral at the edges, deep at the center. It spread warmth through their chest, slow and patient, like a hand resting over a heartbeat. They realized how rarely they truly tasted things anymore, how often they rushed through life, swallowing moments without noticing their flavor. The candle flickered slightly, and the narrator smiled. "All right," they murmured. "I'll slow down." Outside, a bird called somewhere under the eaves, its song muffled but persistent, like a reminder that life carries on quietly, even in rain. The narrator turned their gaze toward the window, where droplets clung to the glass, trembling in the candlelight. Each drop held a tiny reflection of the room, a miniature flame, a fragment of gold in silver rain. It was as if the world were full of small lights, waiting to be seen. They thought about breathing. How simple it was, and yet how often forgotten. Years ago, they had gone through a season where even breathing had felt like work, when anxiety had curled itself around their chest like a fist, squeezing every moment into something smaller, tighter. Nights like that had made them feel like drowning in dry air, but tonight was different. Tonight, they could breathe again. Not perfectly, not always easily, but fully enough to notice. The rain had taught them something, the same lesson it always brought, that nothing lasts forever. Not storms, not fear, not even heaviness. All things move, shift, soften. You just have to let time do its quiet work. They placed the cup down and let their palms rest around its warmth. For the first time in a long while, they felt the rhythm of their body aligning with the rhythm of the world's slow inhale, slow exhale, rain falling, candle flickering, tea cooling. Everything was in conversation, and everything belonged. They thought of the woman from earlier, of her small candle walking through the storm. They wondered if she was asleep now, the little flame glowing beside her bed. The image brought a soft joy, one that settled low in the heart and spread gently outward. The candle on the table bent slightly as the air shifted. Its flame brushed the side of the glass jar, then returned to center. There was something deeply human about that, this instinct to find balance, to keep returning even after being moved. The narrator whispered, almost without realizing, "You're teaching me, aren't you?" The candle crackled faintly, and they laughed under their breath. Maybe lessons didn't always come from words. Sometimes they came from the way light held itself through the dark. The tea had cooled by now, but they drank the last of it anyway. It tasted softer, gentler, almost sweet, the kind of flavor that lingers in memory long after it's gone. They leaned back, letting their bodies sink into the chair. The blanket slipped from their shoulders, but they didn't reach for it. The air was cool, but kind. The candle's glow warmed the room just enough. They closed their eyes, letting the rain and the quiet breathing of the candle fill the space between thoughts. It was enough, this small moment, this gentle night, this soft reminder that peace isn't found. It's made moment by moment, breath by breath. Outside, the rain began again, just slightly stronger. As if applauding softly from the dark, the rain carried on, quiet and patient, like an old friend who knows when not to speak. The candle's flame had grown smaller, yet it burned with the same calm determination, never hurried, never afraid. The narrator sat by the window again, tea finished, blanket drawn around their shoulders. The world beyond the glass shimmered under the faint glow of the streetlights, each droplet turning into a tiny mirror. They leaned closer to the window, watching the patterns the rain made. Some drops slid straight down, quick and sure, while others meandered, joining others halfway, before disappearing into the sill. Each one left a trail of fleeting memory that faded almost as soon as it appeared. It reminded the narrator of people, of how lives sometimes cross only for a moment, before continuing in different directions. For a long time, they simply watched. Their reflection hovered faintly in the glass-soft, tired eyes, a gentle outline of a face illuminated by candlelight. They hadn't really looked at themselves in this way for a while. There was no judgment, no comparison, just quiet recognition. They looked older, yes, but there was something peaceful in it. Something honest. Then, without warning, a memory surfaced clear, bright, uninvited. A rainy afternoon years ago, on a street lined with old trees. They were younger then, rushing somewhere, umbrella tilted awkwardly against the wind. They had passed by a cafe, its windows fogged from warmth within. Inside, someone had been sitting by the glass of face they'd once loved, bent over a cup of coffee, laughing at something unseen. The moment had been brief, barely a second, but it had stayed. They hadn't spoken to that person since. There had been reasons, distance, silence, the way time untangles things that once seemed bound forever. Yet tonight, under this same kind of rain, the memory returned not with pain, but with a quiet sweetness. The kind that comes when you realize that even goodbyes can hold beauty. The candle flickered beside them, light pooling softly over their hands. They whispered to no one in particular, "I hope you're somewhere warm tonight." Outside, thunder murmured faintly, then dissolved into the distance. The air felt cleaner now, the kind of clarity that follows after long rain. They ran a finger along the foggy glass, tracing the outline of a raindrop as it slid downward. For a moment, they imagined they could see the past through its old streets. Lost laughter, a version of themselves who still believed that love could last forever. And in that vision, they didn't feel sadness. Only gratitude. Because even the memories that ache a little are proof that you lived deeply once. They breathed out slowly, watching their breath cloud the window, blending with the mist outside until it disappeared. When they turned back toward the room, the candle's light felt different, warmer, closer. The shadows it cast were softer now, less like ghosts, more like companions. Every corner seemed alive in some small way. The folds of the curtain, the books leaning on one another, the teacup's faint ring of gold left by the light. The narrator thought of how long it had taken them to see beauty in small things again. There had been years when they had rushed through days without noticing the color of rain, the smell of tea, the sound of quiet breathing. But tonight, all of it felt enough. More than enough. They opened their journal finally, the one that had waited all evening without complaint. The pen hovered over the first blank line before moving, slowly but certainly. Tonight the rain came softly, they wrote, and the world felt new again. I remembered someone I used to love, and it didn't hurt. The candle told me that light doesn't erase darkness. It sits beside it, and that's enough. The ink bled slightly into the page, forming soft edges around each word. They smiled, reading it back. It wasn't poetry, but it was truth, and truth had its own quiet music. They closed the notebook gently and returned their gaze to the candle. Its small flame swayed toward them again, as if acknowledging the words. The wax had melted deeply now, a soft pool of amber gathering around the wick. It would not last much longer, but somehow they didn't feel sad, because endings, they thought, are only the places where light changes shape. Outside, the first light of dawn was still hours away, but the rain had begun to lighten, turning to mist. The world was still wrapped in silver shadow, the kind that holds the promise of morning. The narrator rested their hand on the table, palm open toward the warmth of the candle. They didn't wish for the storm to end, or for the night to hurry. They only wished to stay just a little longer in this gentle in-between where memories, rain, and light could exist together. The night grew quieter, as if the storm had tired itself into peace. The candle burned low, its light softer now, yet somehow even more tender. The narrator sat motionless, breathing with the room slow, steady, unhurried. There was no need to fill the silence. The rain and the faint hum of the world were enough. They looked again at the candle. Its little flame leaned slightly to one side, tracing gold along the rim of the glass jar. It was nearly finished, the wax thin and translucent, but it refused to go out. Watching it, the narrator felt something gentle rise within them, a feeling not of sadness, but of clarity. They reached for the journal again and opened to a clean page. This time, the words came easier. A promise to myself, they wrote, to stay soft even when the world feels hard, to light small candles instead of chasing suns, to listen more to rain, to quiet, to people who speak slowly, to rest without guilt, to forgive myself for the years I rushed through living. The sound of pen against paper felt soothing, like footsteps on wet soil. They paused and added one more line, to remember that surviving is not the same as living, and that peace is a choice I can keep making. They set the pen down, leaning back into the chair. The words shimmered faintly in the candlelight before the ink dried. It felt like releasing something heavy they hadn't realized they'd been carrying. For a while, they simply breathed, eyes half closed, hands resting loosely in their lap. They thought of all the promises they'd broken in the past, not to others, but to themselves. Promises to slow down, to listen to their body, to let go of things that hurt. And yet, here they were, still learning, still trying. That counted for something. Outside, the rain had turned almost invisible. Only the sound of droplets slipping from leaves remained, like the earth whispering lullabies to itself. The city beyond the mist was still sleeping. Even the air seemed to hesitate before morning. The candle flickered once, briefly taller, before dipping low again. It seemed to echo the rhythm of a heart learning to trust its own quiet beat. The narrator whispered softly, "I'll keep this promise." And in the hush that followed, the world seemed to listen back. They thought of how easy it is to forget gentleness in a world that rushes and demands and breaks things without meaning to. But here in this small room, with a candle and the scent of rain, they had found a kind of slowness that felt sacred. They smiled at the thought of the woman next door, of her small flame glowing somewhere in the dark. Maybe she too was sitting by her window now. Maybe she too was remembering something kind. It comforted them to think that even in silence, people could be connected by the same soft rituals of staying human. A light, a cup of tea, a promise whispered into the night. They glanced toward the stack of unsent letters still sitting on the table. They didn't need to open them again. Tonight, the weight of unspoken things felt lighter. Forgiveness, they realized, didn't always need words. Sometimes it was enough to breathe differently, to choose calm where once there was fear. The candle wavered, its flame briefly dimming before standing tall again. They found themselves admiring it more than ever, not for its brightness, but for its persistence. There was something deeply hopeful in how it refused to die quietly. They whispered again, this time more firmly, even when it's dark, "I'll stay lit." The words felt like a small vow, one that needed no witness. The blanket slipped down to their elbows, and they didn't bother to pull it back up. The cool air touched their skin gently, like an old memory. They tilted their head, letting the soft crackle of wax become their heartbeat. Time passed without notice. Minutes folded into moments. The candle continued its slow, graceful descent into itself, light and shadow merging on the walls. The narrator thought of morning, but it didn't feel like something to chase. The night still had more to give. They picked up the journal once more and wrote the last words of the night. "When I forget again, and I will, I hope I remember this. Light doesn't need to be bright to be enough." They closed the book, placing their palm over its cover as though sealing a quiet prayer. Then, looking at the candle's trembling glow, they smiled softly, peacefully. The way one smiles at an old friend who's about to leave, but will always return when needed. Outside, a soft breeze carried the faint scent of dawn. Sometime after midnight, the wind began to stir again. It wasn't fierce, just a slow, thoughtful movement through the night, as though the storm hadn't quite finished its story. The narrator could feel the air changing, the subtle hum before rain returns, the quiet tremor in the leaves outside. The candle trembled slightly, but did not falter. Its flame leaned forward, then back, as if bowing to something unseen. The narrator watched, feeling that familiar pull inward, the kind that happens when the outside world mirrors the weather inside your chest. There had been storms like this before. Not outside, but within. The kind that starts with nothing, a stray thought, a memory, and then builds, gathering clouds of fear and regret until everything feels too heavy to breathe through. They had known that weight well once. The sleepless nights, the anxious pacing, the hollow ache that presses against your ribs when you don't know what's wrong, but know it's there. Tonight, though, something was different. The storm outside didn't scare them. The one inside no longer ruled them. It was there, yes, familiar, humming quietly in the corners, but it didn't demand control. It just existed, like weather. They leaned forward and whispered, "It's all right. You can stay." It was strange, talking to their own unease like a friend. But that's what the candle had been teaching all along. That light doesn't fight darkness. It simply shares the space. A soft thunder echoed in the distance, long and low, the kind that feels more like a sigh than a warning. The narrator took another slow breath. They thought of all the nights they had tried to push discomfort away, to drown it in noise or work or words. But every storm they'd resisted had returned louder later. Tonight, they tried something new. Listening, they let the rain come. They let the heart speak. The thoughts arrived gently, memories of times they had failed, moments of sharp words and long silences, faces they had disappointed. But instead of running from them, they simply watched, as if sitting beside each one, candle in hand. The memories didn't vanish. They softened. It was as if the rain was washing dust off old pictures in their mind, revealing that even pain had shape and meaning once. Not everything broken needs mending, they realized. Some things are meant to stay cracked, to let light through. The candle's glow caught a droplet of water sliding down the window, turning it gold for a heartbeat before it vanished. They smiled faintly. "Even the rain glows if you wait long enough," they whispered. They rose from the chair and stretched, bones soft from stillness. The room was filled with that quiet scent of wet air clean, almost metallic, tinged with the sweetness of cooling wax. They opened the window just a little, enough for the wind to carry the sound of rain into the room. It came in gentle waves, each one brushing against the candle's warmth. The narrator closed their eyes. The rhythm of rain began to sync with their breathing again. Inhale, exhale, drop, fall, hush. They felt small, but in the right way. The kind of small that fits perfectly inside the universe. A flash of lightning brightened the sky, followed by a slow roll of thunder. The candle's flame danced wildly for a moment before returning to center. They whispered, "That's how it feels, isn't it?" They meant the heart, the way it wavers when shaken, yet somehow always finds its balance again. Stillness. They felt a tenderness that was hard to name. It wasn't joy exactly, or sorrow, but something between a quiet acceptance. The kind that comes only after you stop demanding life to be tidy or certain. The kind that stays. They sat back down, resting their forehead on folded arms. The candle flickered softly beside them, and for a moment, they felt like the two were breathing together. Outside, the rain began to thin, leaving only the sound of water dripping from the eaves. Rhythmic and kind. The narrator thought. This is how storms end, not with silence, but with gentleness. they lifted their head again, eyes half-lidded with fatigue, but peaceful. The wax around the wick was low now, almost gone. Soon, the flame would surrender, but that too felt right. Nothing needed to last forever to matter. They whispered into the quiet, "Thank you for staying through this with me." And though the candle said nothing, its glow deepened warm and alive to the very last dot outside. The last drops of rain clung to the window, trembling under the faint blush of dawn, hidden somewhere behind the cloud's dot inside. The narrator sat still, heart lighter, breath deeper. The storm within had quieted. The thunder rolled away completely now, leaving behind a silence so vast that it seemed to hum. It was a living quiet, full of echoes, the kind that comes only after a storm has given everything it had to give. The candle flickered faintly, its flame thinner but unwavering, like an elder whispering final words of wisdom before dawn. The narrator sat still, wrapped again in their blanket, body sinking deeper into calm. They listened to that silence, realizing it wasn't empty at all. It was filled with small sounds that the noise of rain had hidden before. The soft tick of cooling wood, the sigh of air moving through a tiny crack in the window, the faint rustle of their own heartbeat. Every sound seemed to carry meaning. Every vibration felt like the world's way of saying, "You are still here." They remembered the years when thunder had frightened them, when the first flash of lightning would send them searching for places to hide. It had taken years, decades, even to understand that thunder wasn't angry. It was simply honest. It was the sky's way of releasing what it couldn't hold anymore. And maybe that's what people were meant to do, to release, not repress. Speak, not swallow. Let the storm move through, so peace could follow after. They looked at the candle again, how it wavered and returned, over and over, patient as breath. That was its language, the conversation between surrender and persistence. The flame never tried to fight the air. It danced with it. They whispered, "So this is how we learn." Thunder, after all, had been their first teacher. It taught them that noise could be natural, that the heart's unrest could sound like rain on a roof, not a warning, but a rhythm. And the candle, this small, glowing friend, taught them the rest. How to stay soft even when shaken. How to keep glowing without needing to be seen. They sipped what little remained of their tea, now cool but still fragrant, and felt warmth blooming somewhere deep within. Their gaze wandered to the bookshelf again, to the old books and their tired spines. Each one carried a quiet story about endurance, about time. Even paper wears storms, and yet still holds words. Maybe that was another kind of resilience, silent, humble, but unbroken. They stood up and stretched slowly, walking toward the window. The city outside was dark, washed clean, glistening under the scattered lights. Puddles shimmered like fragments of gloss, reflecting the faint movements of clouds that were finally beginning to drift apart. Somewhere, the first bird dared to sing. Its sound was thin, uncertain, but brave. The narrator smiled. "You're early," they murmured, voice almost lost to the breeze. They touched the glass lightly with their fingertips. It was cool and smooth. Beyond it, the world looked softer than it had hours ago, edges blurred, colors muted. But that was the beauty of rain, wasn't it? It erased harsh lines, reminded everything to slow down. They thought of all the storms that had come before this one, the emotional ones, the ones that had broken them down quietly when no one was watching. How some had left scars, others had left wisdom. And yet, through all of them, something had remained. The small flame inside, the one that refused to go out. They whispered, "You never really left me, did you?" The candle flickered in reply, as if nodding Dot in that moment. They realized something simple but profound. Peace wasn't a destination waiting after the storm. It was the ability to light a candle during one. They turned from the window and sat again, facing the dying flame. The wax had nearly run out. The glass jar was warm to the touch, but the glow still painted soft gold across their skin. They imagined, just for a moment, that their mother was there, again hands steady, face calm, eyes reflecting the same flame. They could almost hear her say, "See? It never really goes dark. Not if you remember where to look." The narrator exhaled slowly, a tear slipping down not from sorrow, but from understanding. They whispered into the still air, "I remember now." The candle wavered one last time, strong for a heartbeat, then settled into perfect stillness. Outside, the horizon began to pale. The clouds were drifting apart, revealing a soft silver line, the first hint of dawn breaking through the night's lone patience. The narrator smiled faintly. The thunder had taught them strength. The candle had taught them gentleness. Between the two, they had learned how to begin again. The air after the storm always felt different, cleaner, lighter, as though the whole world had washed its face and was waiting quietly for morning. The narrator inhaled deeply, feeling the cool dampness settle into their lungs. Everything smelled faintly of rain and earth and new beginnings. The candle was now a small pool of wax in silence, its wick still warm but dark. The narrator smiled softly at it, grateful for its company through the long night. Even unlit, it still felt alive, somehow proof that light, once given, doesn't vanish. It simply lingers in memory. They rose from the chair, stretching slowly, bones creaking like old wood. The room around them looked tender in the half-light, every corner brushed with the faint gray of approaching dawn. A sense of still purpose moved through them, the quiet energy that comes not from doing, but from being. They noticed the small frame on the shelf, tilted slightly to one side. The photo inside had gathered a thin film of dust. It showed a seaside morning from years ago, a stretch of sand, a figure waving, sunlight caught in their hair. The narrator took it down, ran a thumb over the glass. The dust smeared easily, leaving behind a clearer view. They whispered, "You'd laugh if you saw how sentimental I'd become." The memory of that morning rose easily, the laughter, the salt wind, the feeling that life would last forever. They smiled, not in sorrow this time, but in gratitude. Memories didn't fade to hurt. They faded to softness, like rain easing into mist. Setting the photo back upright, they glanced toward the desk. The letters still rested there, bound again with the faded string. They decided to keep them not as burdens, but as markers of growth, proof that the heart had once dared to speak, even if only to itself. The candle's glass was warm to the touch. They lifted it carefully, placing it beside the window where the first morning light might reach it later. There was beauty in this small ritual, tending to things that had served you, acknowledging their quiet work before letting them rest. Then their gaze fell on the loose frame hanging by the door. It had been crooked for months, maybe longer. Tonight, or rather, this early morning felt like the right time to fix it. They fetched a small hammer and nail from the drawer, the metal cold against their skin. As they adjusted the frame, they thought about how healing often begins with gestures like this, tiny acts of care that seem almost trivial, but speak loudly to the soul. When the frame was straight again, they stepped back, admiring the balance. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. A light smile crossed their lips. "Good enough," they said softly. Returning to the table, they picked up the matchbox and struck one match. The sound was a small hiss, followed by sudden warmth. They didn't light another candle, only watched the small flame burn on the stick itself, brief and bright. It lasted less than a minute before reaching their fingers. They shook it out gently, a curl of smoke rising into the air. The room smelled faintly of sulfur, and rain sharpness followed by sweetness. The narrator sat back down and reached for their journal again. The page from earlier waited, still open. They added a few words beneath the last line. This morning, I fixed a frame, cleaned a photo, and thanked a candle. Small things, maybe, but small things keep the world from falling apart. They read the sentence twice and underlined it once. Outside, a soft breeze stirred the curtains, brushing their cheek. The first bird sang again, louder this time, joined by another. The sky beyond the window had begun to glow faintly blue-gray, shifting into pale silver. The night was over, but it hadn't left them. It had simply changed form, leaving quiet understanding in its place. They poured the last of the tea into their cup, though it was barely warm now. It didn't matter. They drank it slowly, savoring its faint sweetness, then set the cup down with a quiet clink that felt final and full dot. It was strange how the smallest acts, the straightening of a frame, the writing of a sentence, the setting down of a cup could feel like prayers. None of them were grand, yet together they stitched something whole. They looked once more toward the candle by the window. It sat there peacefully, waiting for light to find it again. "Thank you," they whispered Dot outside. The clouds parted slightly, and a pale thread of dawn slipped through, touching the glass, catching the edge of the extinguished candle. For one fleeting moment, it glowed again, not from flame, but from morning. The narrator smiled. "You see, the light always returns." And with that, they leaned back, letting the sound of waking birds and the faint rustle of rain-soaked leaves carry them gently into the first quiet hour of day. The faint silver of dawn was spreading now, stretching its quiet fingers across the room. Shadows softened. Shapes reappeared: the bookshelf, the curtain, the small puddle of wax where the candle had ended its long vigil. Everything looked freshly born, touched by the light's first forgiveness. The power flickered back on with a small hum. The refrigerator resumed its low murmur. A street lamp outside blinked and dimmed, and somewhere down the hall, a clock began to tick with new certainty. The narrator smiled at the sound. The world was waking up, but they didn't rush to switch on any other lights. The gentle blue-gray of early morning was enough. They wanted to let it enter slowly, the way one lets a friend back into a quiet room after a long absence. They rose from the chair and walked barefoot across the floor, feeling the cool wood under their soles. A few drops of wax clung to the tabletop. They didn't wipe them away. Some traces, they thought, deserved to remain a quiet reminder of what once burned for you. Dot at the window. They pushed the curtain aside. The world outside was softened by mist. Water beaded on the telephone wires, turning them into strings of tiny pearls. The street was almost empty, except for a delivery van moving slowly, tires whispering on the wet road. The air smelled clean-washed, free of yesterday. They rested their forehead lightly against the glass. The chill felt grounding, almost comforting. After a long night of reflection and silence, the simplicity of the morning felt like a kind of grace. The candle's reflection still lingered faintly on the window pane, even though the flame was gone. It glowed just enough to remind them that presence doesn't always mean light. They whispered, "You did well." In the corner of the room, the box of letters caught a sliver of dawn. The string around them shimmered faintly. The narrator found themselves walking over, not to open it, but to place a small slip of paper on top. On it, they wrote just one line: "Thank you for teaching me how to let go." They set the note gently beneath the string and closed the box. This time, when they looked at it, it no longer felt like a weight of what-ifs. It felt like a finished chapter. The sound of dripping water drew their attention. They followed it to the open window, where a few raindrops still fell from the eaves, landing softly on the sill. Each drop sparkled briefly before disappearing. They let their finger catch one, cool and fleeting. It rolled down their skin, leaving a tiny trail of light. Dot, and suddenly, they thought of all the storms in their life, Not just tonight's, but the invisible ones. Heartbreaks, departures, years of trying too hard to be strong. Each one had left something behind, just as each raindrop left a glint before vanishing. Maybe healing wasn't about forgetting those storms. Maybe it was about learning how to see the shimmer they left behind. They took a deep breath, the kind that fills every corner of the lungs. The air felt new. Inside, something had unclenched. They glanced at the teacup still sitting near the candle's remains. A thin ring of gold circled the bottom of it, catching the dawn's light. They traced it with their fingertip, smiling. "You too," they said softly. "You stayed till the end." Then, as if moved by instinct, they began to tidy the room, not to erase the night, but to honor it. They folded the blanket, smoothed the pages of the open journal, placed the pencil neatly beside it. They lifted the empty candle jar and washed it gently under warm water. The wax slid away in ribbons, revealing clean glass beneath. When they set it down to dry, the jar caught the morning light and gleamed. It looked almost like it was glowing again. The narrator stood there, hands damp, eyes soft. There was a strange joy in this small moment, in washing, in folding, in putting things back in their place. Every action whispered a truth the night had taught them. Peace doesn't arrive all at once. It's something you make, over and over. With gentle hands, they carried the candle jar back to the window and placed it on the sill, where the sun would find it soon. The sky outside had turned from gray to pale gold. The first clear light of morning spilled across the wet rooftops, catching puddles, rooftops, and leaves in its slow embrace. The city was beginning to move again. Somewhere, a door opened. Somewhere else, laughter drifted faintly from a radio. Life was resuming its rhythm. The narrator stood there a while longer, watching the mist lift from the trees, feeling no rush to join the day just yet. Inside, everything was still. The candle had done its part. The storm had, too. Both had left behind a silence rich enough to last Dot, and so they whispered with the softest breath, "Thank you, night. I'll remember your light." Then they opened the window a little wider, letting the morning air sweep gently into the room, carrying with it the quiet scent of rain and the promise of beginning again. Dot, by the time the sun began to rise in full, the rain had faded into nothing more than a shimmer in the air, tiny droplets catching the early light before vanishing into warmth. The clouds, which had held the night for so long, were breaking apart now, their edges tinged with gold. The world felt new, rinsed of its noise, the kind of morning where even silence seemed to sparkle. The narrator stood at the window, eyes half closed, soaking in the soft brightness. It wasn't a dramatic sunrise, just a slow bloom of pale color across the sky's silver turning peach, then gently into blue. They preferred it that way. Loud beauty had its place, but this quiet one suited them more. The candle jar glowed faintly on the sill, not from flame, but from sunlight. Its glass caught the day, like it had caught the night before, bending it into something gentler. The narrator reached out, touching it lightly. It was cool now, but the memory of warmth lingered like the echo of a kind word long after it's spoken. They turned toward the table. Everything was just as they'd left it. The cup, the journal, the folded blanket. Morning light touched each object in turn, making ordinary things holy. It was strange how dawn could transform even the smallest corners of life into something. Sacred how it asked for nothing but attention to be seen. They sat back down, opening the journal again. The ink from last night had dried into soft gray lines. They ran a hand across the page, reading what they had written, and smiled. The words felt calmer now, as though they belonged to someone wiser and gentler. To stay soft, one line read. To keep lighting small candles. They nodded quietly. The promise still felt right. For a moment, they closed their eyes and listened. Outside, the city was waking slowly. The distant sound of a broom sweeping wet leaves, a door creaking open, a kettle whistling somewhere. It all blended into one soft rhythm, familiar and kind. They thought again of the woman from the night before, the one who had come for a match and left, with a flame. They wondered if she had slept well, if her candle was still standing by her window. Maybe she was sipping tea right now, the way they were. Maybe she, too, was watching the same dawn. The thought filled them with quiet gladness. The storm had passed, yes, but it had left connection in its wake. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. Sometimes light didn't spread through grand gestures. Sometimes it moved one person at a time, from hand to hand, match to match. They rose from the chair and opened the window wider. A cool breeze drifted in, carrying the smell of wet pavement and distant bread from the bakery on the corner. Somewhere, the first rays of sunlight hit the roofs, and steam lifted like sighs of release. The narrator whispered, "After the storm, everything breathes again." They could feel that breath inside them too, the ease that follows release, the softness that follows surrender. In the distance, they saw a small puddle gleaming at the edge of the street. A sparrow hopped to its edge, dipped its beak once, then fluttered away. Simple, perfect. It reminded them of something their mother had once said while drying dishes by the window. The world always starts over after rain. You just have to notice it. They smiled at the memory. She had been right, of course. The world was always starting over. Turning back to the room, they noticed the candle jar gleaming more brightly now, full of sunlight. It looked for a heartbeat, as though it had relieved itself. The narrator laughed softly. "Still burning, aren't you?" And in a way, it was. Light had simply changed form. It had moved from fire to glass. From flame to morning. They poured themselves one last cup of tea, this time fresh, steaming, fragrant. As they lifted it, they paused to whisper a small toast. To storms that teach, to candles that stay, and to mornings that remind us we've survived. The tea was perfect. The first sip warm and alive on the tongue. It filled the room again with jasmine, the same scent that had carried them through the night. They sat there, watching the light grow stronger, the city stir, the sky unfold. The world was still imperfect, still fragile, but that no longer felt like a flaw. It was what made it human. The candle had ended, yes, but its glow had become something else, something unseen yet present, woven quietly into the day. They closed the journal gently, letting the page rest open to the light. The words there looked different now, no longer just ink on paper, but living reminders. Outside, a final droplet of rain slid down the window, catching the sunlight as it fell. It shone like a star for the briefest moment before disappearing into the earth. The narrator whispered, "That's enough." And it was. The morning unfolded in quiet gold. The mist lifted slowly from the streets, revealing rooftops still jeweled with rain. The city yawned and began to stretch doors opening, footsteps echoing on the damp pavement, the hum of ordinary life returning. The narrator stayed by the window, watching it all from their small room that still smelled faintly of wax and jasmine. The candle jar gleamed on the sill, its glass now filled with sunlight. It no longer needed to burn. It had become a vessel for light itself. The narrator traced a finger along its rim, smiling softly. "You did your part," they whispered. "You stayed until the end." A small breeze slipped through the window, brushing against their face, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something faintly sweet perhaps from the bakery below. It mingled with the lingering warmth of tea, with the hush that only follows long storms, the kind of hush that feels earned. They turned their gaze back to the journal, still open on the table. Last night's writing waited there, a small constellation of words beneath the soft shadow of dawn. They read them again, but not for meaning, just for the sound. the rhythm of their own quiet promise spoken back to them by morning light, to keep lighting small candles. The phrase glowed faintly, like the wick before it catches flame. They realized that this vow wasn't just for nights of storm, it was for every day. Every small act of gentleness that keeps a heart alive. A kind word, a slow breath. A door left open for someone who needs it. The kettle began to hum again in the kitchen, breaking the silence gently. The narrator rose, poured the last of the water into a clean cup, and carried it back to the window. The steam curled upward like a quiet spirit rising. Outside, a child was walking with her father, boots splashing lightly through shallow puddles. She laughed each time the water rippled, a clear, bell-like sound that seemed to reach all the way up to the window. The narrator found themselves smiling, heart softening at the sight. The world, it seemed, had already begun again. The candle's glass caught that laughter, too, scattering it into a shimmer of light across the walls. It was as if the room itself were exhaling, saying thank you to the night that had passed. The narrator sat down once more and let their thoughts drift not to the past, not to what might come, but to this exact breath, this exact morning. They felt neither lonely nor full, just balanced, as though everything, rain, silence, memory, warmth, had folded into one long note of peace. They closed the journal and tied it shut with a thin ribbon, placing it beside the box of letters. It joined the quiet archive of nights that had shaped them, the kind that left no scars, only gentle imprints, proof that even storms can heal. Looking around the room, they felt gratitude for every small thing, the blanket that had held their bodies' warmth, the tea that had carried comfort, the candle that had burned with steady grace. Everything that stays, they murmured, does so by being gentle. The sunlight brightened, stretching deeper into the room, painting the wooden floor in gold. It touched the edge of the candle jar, then spilled upward, filling the space with a soft radiance that needed no flame. The narrator watched the light, move, and thought about resilience, not as strength that resists, but as light that adapts. The candle hadn't fought the storm. It had danced within it. The rain hadn't ruined the night. It had washed it clean. And maybe that's what it means to live. Well, not to chase brightness or avoid darkness, but to let them meet over and over until the heart learns how to glow quietly on its own. They closed their eyes, breathing in the scent of the morning. In that stillness, they imagined the candle speaking one last time, not in words, but in warmth. You see, you never needed me to stay. You only needed to remember that you could. The narrator smiled, eyes still closed, letting the message sink deep. They whispered back, "I'll remember." When they opened their eyes again, the world was fully awake. Sunlight filled the window. The city's heartbeat had returned. But inside the room, the calm remained, a soft, glowing echo of everything that had been learned in the dark. They picked up the candle jar one last time, held it against the light, and set it gently back on the sill. Then they stood for a while longer, watching the reflections dance, listening to the morning as it unfolded. And when they finally turned away, they did so with a heart made lighter by the simplest of truths, that the candle and the storm were never enemies. They had always belonged to the same sky.